Good evening and welcome to tonight's discussion, History, Truth, and Evidence. My name is Leah Wolfson and I am twice alumna of Emory University, Emory College in English and Jewish Studies, and the Laney Graduate School for my doctorate in comparative literature. I am currently the Rosalind Unger Director of Campus Outreach at the Jack Joseph and Morton Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Let me first begin by welcoming our new students and their families. I am proud and humbled to be speaking to such a diverse and accomplished group of people embarking on their college adventure, and more than a little bit envious. Tonight, we welcome prospective students from across the country and around the world. I am so excited for you as you begin this new journey. First, a bit of housekeeping. This evening's event is being presented in the webinar format, and we invite you to send us your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen throughout the program. We will collect and answer as many as we can. It is truly my privilege to introduce Dr. Debra Lipstadt, Durow Professor of Modern Jewish and Holocaust Studies. Rather than reciting a list of Dr. Lipstadt's many accomplishments, publications, and awards, I want to instead introduce her in the way that she has impacted me the most over my studies and my career. Tonight, it is a rare privilege for a student to introduce her teacher. When I made an appointment in the fall of my freshman year in order to gain permission to enroll in Dr. Lipstadt's 300-level Holocaust and film course, her reputation preceded her. The then closet-sized office in the Callaway South building was peppered with photographs of Dr. Lipstadt with various intellectuals and public luminaries. But instead of encountering an aloof scholar with mere minutes to spare, we talked at length about why I wanted to take the course, what I hoped to get out of it, and why I was interested in Holocaust studies. Indeed, it was her presence, her engagement, and her investment in the classroom that turned a single course into a long-standing mentorship, a mentorship that has really become the cornerstone of my career. An 8-person seminar at 8:30 in the morning is very often deadly, and this one teemed with energetic discussion. Professor Lipstadt's final exam always asked her students, "What is your next question?" The result was always far more complex than at the start of the term. Which brings us to tonight and what I know will be a thought-provoking discussion about history, truth, and evidence, topics that are all too relevant in the world today. While we'll be focusing on this subject as it relates to Holocaust studies, and on which Debra Lipstadt has much to say, both based on her scholarly work and her personal experience, the implications are far-reaching. In a world in which facts and evidence are questioned, denied, or twisted, in a digital age that so often flattens out or predetermines the information that we consume, this conversation seems all the more pressing. And a large part of the reason that this topic is the center of our conversation tonight is because the college classroom is exactly the place where history, truth, and evidence get explored. Tonight offers but a small window into what happens inside Emory courses every day. Students and teachers in a room learning both from and with one another. Welcome, Dr. Lipstadt.
Thank you, Leah. I couldn't have asked for Dr. Wolfson, since I couldn't have asked for a more wonderful and appreciated introduction. So, we're taught, I've learned a great deal from my teachers. I've learned even more from my friends, but most of all, I've learned from my students, and I learn from you all the time.
Well, the feeling is mutual, and it's really a pleasure. So I think we'll start with unpacking a little bit about when we think about evidence as it relates to the Holocaust. What are we talking about? What types of sources were we talking about when this history was first being studied? And what type of evidence do we have today?
Well, in the beginning, there was an emphasis on documents. Now, that was partially because documents seemed official, documents seemed trustworthy. And of course, the Nuremberg trials, the International Military Tribunal, which takes place very quickly after the war, when you think about how fast it is, it's by the fall of 45, gathered tremendous amounts of documents, so that the earliest histories of the Holocaust were built and written based primarily on those documents. But there was also a certain bias with which you were well familiar, maybe not personally, but studying historically, a bias towards documents. Documents were believable, documents were real, no one could alter a document, whereas testimony of survivors, less trustworthy, traumatic, hysterical. Can we really believe what they're saying? Maybe they're making a little bit of it up, not in the form so much of Holocaust denial, but Well, I would say there were two things that helped reinforce that idea. One was misogyny, so that women, if it was a woman testifying, well, remember, you won't remember, but some of the parents listening or may remember their parents watching Dragnet. And there was a character on Dragnet, Joe Friday, played by Jack Webb, I think it was. And whenever he was interviewing a woman, he would say, "Just the facts, ma'am, just the facts," because women, got all flighty. So it was that the survivor was treated that, men and women, just the facts, and can we really believe them? And I think in some cases there was a little bit of anti-Semitism there. Can we trust these Jews? The Jews were always crying that they were special victims, etc. So survivor testimony was discounted and documents were given precedent. Now, in addition to documents, there was certain material evidence, but much of that is not really addressed till later. Now, the situation I'm describing is evident in one of the earliest and fantastic histories of the destruction process by Raoul Hilberg, and he openly said, I go by documents. Of course, the problem with that is who wrote the documents? And when did they write it? And did they want to make themselves look good, or were they telling the accuracy of what happened, et cetera, et cetera? So to treat a document as sacrosanct doesn't quite work. I would say about in the 90s, Marion Kaplan's book, Between Dignity and Despair, and of course the work by Shaul Friedlander, including his book, The Years of Extermination, which won the Pulitzer Prize, took a different approach. And they said, we triangulate documents with memoirs, with documents with diaries. We look for where they cross and where one supplements the other. And then, and I'm sure we'll get to this, when I was on trial, we took a third thing and we added material evidence. So that's a long answer to your question.
No, it's, I think what it really demonstrates is the richness of that evidence, right? It's not just coming from one place. It's not just coming from one perspective. It's really coming from these multiple places. And it has evolved over the years in terms of what we look at, but it's only gotten larger in terms of
and there's more, and people think we know everything about the Holocaust, which is so untrue. There's so much more to know. And you and I were just a few moments ago, before we came on a screen, we're discussing a new book written by a good friend of mine, a former colleague of yours, Wendy Lauer, Professor Wendy Lauer from Claremont McKenna, called The Ravine. She was working at the museum. She was the director of the Mandel Center, which you now are part of, and you were then for a couple of years. And someone came into the museum with a photograph of a woman being shot. And she figured out where this was, who were the shooters, who were the photographers, what capacity. The shooters were not killers. They were tax collectors. They were supposed to collect the tax but someone said, come help us shoot Jews, and etc. From one photo, from the basis of one photograph. And this was just a few years ago. So there's more to know. And the story of the photographer, who everybody thought was part of the killing process, when in actuality, he was disgusted and he was taking these pictures as evidence against what was happening. So there's lots more to know.
Yeah, and I'm always so struck by that, which then to me begs the question, when we think about Holocaust denial, on the one hand, this is clearly a very pressing issue. On the other hand, it seems and is patently ridiculous. So I'm wondering if you can unpack for us a little bit, what are the deniers denying? And how has that changed over the years?
Well, we're living right now. For a while there, when I used to talk about Holocaust denial, I would explain it's a conspiracy theory, and people were sort of interested in listening exactly what is a conspiracy theory. And of course, today we live in an age of conspiracy theories, and how, whether it's about COVID, whether it's about vaccines, whether it's about immigration, the conspiracy theories abound and are given life by people who are quite influential on the general public. first of all, and some of the students listening, prospective students listening, may be interested in the TED Talk I gave on Holocaust denial. And in that TED Talk, I start by asking the question, or by posing, for deniers to be right, who say that what the deniers say is there was no plan to kill the Jews. Hitler didn't intend to do this. The Jews may have suffered, but so did lots of people. There were no gas chambers. There was no mass extermination, annihilation of the Jews. So I begin by sort of turning that claim on its head and saying, for deniers to be right, who has to be wrong? So first of all those documents, those tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of millions, some of which are in the library where you work at the Holocaust Museum, many of which, the documents would have to be wrong. The survivors would have to be wrong. The bystanders, the people who lived in the towns near the death camps, who lived in the towns near the concentration camps, the people who lived in the villages, the towns near these shooting sites, who watched the Jews being marched out, and sometimes went out and watched themselves because it was sort of like a bank holiday. Let's go, a festival, a fall festival or whatever. Let's go watch them being shot. Who else would have to be wrong? Thousands and thousands of scholars, and not just scholars in North America or South America, but Europe, Israel, Japan, China. There's no continent that Australia, there's no continent you can mention which doesn't have scholars who work in this. So either they would all have to be part of this conspiracy theory that making this all up, or they would have had to been duped. But most of all, who would have to be wrong is the perpetrators. In no war crimes trial of a German, of an ally of the Germans, of an East German, a European, of a Belgian, a French, whatever, has a perpetrator ever said it didn't happen. They've said, I didn't do it, or I had no choice, but not that it didn't happen. Even Adolf Eichmann, one of the trials about which I've written and which I'm teaching now in the class where Professor Fenves's father came to lecture via Zoom, don't worry, via Zoom. Even then, he didn't say it didn't happen. So deniers have no narrative, no witnesses, no evidence, nothing. They come along, 20 years later and they say it didn't happen. So you have to ask what else is going on there. And I think for many deniers, the Holocaust is inconvenient history. You love the Germans, you love what Nazism stood for, you hate the Jews, you don't like to see Jews getting sympathy, all those kind of things. And so denial becomes a means of combating that.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because we've talked about this before, and I've heard you characterize it as this. There's the kind of Holocaust denial that denies the Holocaust full stop. And then there's the kind that kind of says, well, this happened, but not like that, or not as extreme as
That's
that.
right.
That in many ways is just as insidious, if not more so, because it kind of masquerades as something that
you're absolutely
smells a little bit like not quite as fishy, if you'll
right. You're absolutely correct. You must have had very good scholarly training. It is more insidious. I describe it, and it's a term that's been picked up. In fact, people have said to me, well, what you're saying can be described as, and I said, yes, I invented the terms, softcore and hardcore Holocaust denial. And most of us are familiar with softcore and hardcore because in relation to pornography. But I use those terms because I find Holocaust denial a treatment of history, which is like pornography treatment of sexuality and sex and women, et cetera, et cetera. Hardcore Holocaust denial is what I had to face in court, what I've been describing. There were no gas chambers. Hitler didn't have a plan to kill the Jews. The Jews are making this all up. the softcore denial is what we see going on right now as you and I speak to two scholars you know personally who have had offices, I don't know what, 10 feet from your office at the Holocaust Museum, Barbara Engelking and Jan Grabowski, Barbara is, Professor Engelking is located in Poland, and Professor Grabowski, who is from Poland, teaches in Ontario, I believe that's correct. Are both being sued by the Polish government. In fact, Masha Gessen just wrote about this in the New Yorker, I think this week or last week, for what they have written about the Holocaust. Now, what's going on there? The Poles are not engaging in hardcore denial. No, they're saying, of course, the Holocaust happened. They say, 3 million Poles were killed, or sometimes they say 6 million Poles, which is a number that was made up because Stalin would have been upset. There were 3 million Polish Jews killed. And Jews in Poland were called Jews. They weren't called Poles by Poles, as Polish Jews sometimes say. It's only when we got killed that they began to call us Poles or consider us Poles. And there were many Polish Christians who were killed too and treated horribly, horrifically. In Auschwitz I, in the camp, just for common people who've been there, the red brick part of the camp, not Birkenau. There were many Poles, Polish Catholics primarily. But there were Poles who were rescuers. I think at Yad Vashem, which has tributes to rescuers, the greatest number of rescuers are from Poland. Of course, that's where the greatest number of victims were. But of course, there were rescuers and Poles who at the risk to their own lives, which was not the case in other countries. In other countries, if you helped save a Jew, you weren't killed. In Poland, you were very likely to be killed. The people who helped hide Anna Frank were not, and her family were not killed. But they helped Jews, they hid Jews, they passed false documents to them, etc. But those who study Poland closely, and I'm not one of them, argue that there were many more of the former than the latter. Many more people who turned Jews over. When I say the former, I mean Poles who turned Jews over for a couple of zloty, who were happy to see Germans take them away or felt they could get advantage by taking them away. And I don't know who was more or who was less, but there certainly were many who cooperated. I don't like to say to use the word collaborate because that's a term I would use more for France, which you study and which you know so well, than I would use for Poland. But they certainly cooperated with the Germans and told them about Jews and ratted on Jews, et cetera, et cetera. So Poland, the Polish government, the current Polish government, which is a right-wing government, and wants Poland to be thought of strictly as victims. We were victims. We didn't participate. We didn't, et cetera. Passed a law a couple of years ago, making a criminal offense, and then they turned it to a civil offense because that was a little less harsh. They were heavily criticized for claiming that the Polish nation was collaborating. Well, no one is saying Poland as a whole, because there really was no Polish national government, but there were many Poles who collaborated. So this is an attempt to go after these two very fine historians and to put them on trial for blaspheming, for libeling, for whatever term you want to use, the country of Poland. So that's a form of softcore denial, not denying the facts, but sort of depicting, people who helped, who were part of the crime of the Holocaust, presenting themselves as not, as being victims as opposed to having helped. We see the same thing in Hungary. When Adolf Eichmann arrived in Budapest in March of '44 to begin, the German troops had taken over a week or so earlier. He arrives about 10 days afterwards. And when he arrives there, he comes with a couple of hundred maximum SS men. Then within the 7-week period between May and the beginning of July, 1944, they deport over 400,000 Jews, well over 400,000 Jews. I think it's 450, 60, of whom you may have the exact figures there. I think 425,000 are murdered in Auschwitz. You don't do that with a couple of hundred SS people. You do that with the assistance of hundreds of people, with the assistance of the Hungarian railways, with the assistance of Hungarian police, of Hungarian militia, all sorts of fascist right-wing Hungarian groups. You do that with the help of the railways, who put their cars at your disposal, of course, make a lot of money for being paid for doing this. And you do it with the help of Hungarians who are willing to turn over Jews. Not all Hungarians, but some. So today, Hungary, particularly under its current prime minister and its current government, wants to present itself as having been a victim. So we were victims of the Nazis, and then they would say we were victims of communism. So that's the kind of soft core denial that is, as you say, more both insidious and invidious, because it's so hard to fight.
Yeah, so thank you for going into that. I think that raises a lot of really important questions about kind of what you were talking about before, about how one can read evidence, also how someone can very consciously not just misread evidence, right, but read it with a very specific agenda in mind, as both of those examples really show you. And I wanted to kind of bring this back to the classroom a little bit, that, I know you teach memoirs, you teach primary sources, you teach secondary sources, you teach the whole swath of different types of things when you approach different things that you're looking at. So when you're teaching your students, how do you kind of teach to understand the difference between an argument and kind of the argument that isn't an argument, right? In the way that you just described, the argument that really has that ideology steeped behind it.
Yeah, well, I very often describe to them what we did in my trial. I was, as you well know, you remember, you were on campus at that point. I was sued for libel by the world's leading Holocaust denier, depicted in the movie Denial. What we did, we had to prove, I was the defendant, I was the one being sued. And we didn't want to prove the Holocaust happened, because you don't have trials to prove the Holocaust happened. We wanted to prove that I was correct when I called this man a Holocaust denier and a liar. So what did we do? We followed the footnotes back to the sources. And I think you were in a seminar I taught using the sources. I think you may have been. And we looked to show, what do the sources tell us? What do the documents tell us? And how is it being falsified? There's one, I'll give you one example, which I use in my classes quite often. In fact, I'm going to teach it tomorrow in my Holocaust in the Courtroom seminar. In April 1943, Admiral Horthy, the head of the Hungarian government, we're just talking about Hungary, so let's stay with Hungary, and has a meeting with Hitler and with Foreign Minister Ribbentrop. And this is while Hungary is still an ally of the Germans, an independent nation. The Germans haven't gone in and taken over. When they do go in, Horthy will say, I'm going to cooperate with you. So he becomes, the leader of the country, even when it's under the Germans. But they're berating him because though he has instituted a myriad of anti-Semitic regulations, though Jews have been taken to work camps where tens of thousands have died and been treated horrifically, he hasn't agreed to the deportation of the Jews. So in April 43, and certainly in March 44, when the Germans come into Hungary, the Hungarian Jewish community is the last large intact Jewish community on the European continent. Yes, the Swiss Jewish community is intact, but it's a tiny Jewish community. Hungary has about 800,000 Jews, something in that number. So in April 43, Hitler and Ribbentrop have this meeting with Horthy in order to pressure him to deport the Jews. And he says to them, what do you expect me to do? To deport the Jews, that they should die like beasts in the field? They die in work camps, that's one thing. And Hitler says, the meeting's over 2 days. So in the first day, he says, no, that's not necessary. On the second day of the meeting, he says, this is in mid-April 43, I think it's the 15th and the 16th, or the 16th and the 17th. He says, no, the Jews must be taken. First Ribbentrop says the Jews must be taken to concentration camps and allowed to die. And then Hitler says, the Jews are like tuberculous bacilli. If they're not killed, they spread to others. That's why you even have to put down the babies. You have to kill the babies because, like, you kill a young animal that has a disease. You don't want it. It's a prescription for murder. Blood is dripping from everywhere. And that's how the meeting. We have a transcript of the meeting because there was someone taking notes. And that's how the meeting sort of ends. Now, how does David Irving deal with that in his book, Hitler's War, in which he tries to sort of defend Hitler and say this didn't happen, certainly in the edition that comes out in the 90s? He reverses the sequence. So you're talking about evidence. Sometimes I will say to my students, take an article from the newspaper, off the internet, I don't care what article it is, and just by reversing sequence of events, change the meaning of the article. Or you can also change a positive to a negative, or you can put someone at the meeting who wasn't there, etc. And they think it's going to be very hard, and they're always amazed at how easy it is. So what does David Irving do? He changes the sequence. He has the meeting ending with Hitler saying, no, that's not necessary, saying as if he ended the meeting, he told Horthy at a time which was the height of the killing, mid-43, no, it's not necessary to deport them. Then he takes Ribbentrop's statement, which should be taken to concentration camps to die. He buries that in a footnote, which is, as a historian, that's really irresponsible. And then the final thing he does in his author's voice, as you know from all the material you've written, you always want to sort of explain to your readers what's going on, what's the issue here, So he wants, in his author's voice, he wants to explain to his readers why it is so important for Hitler to get the Jews out of Budapest. Why is he so concerned about that? If he's not thinking about killing them, which of course he argues he's not. And he says in the author's voice, and I paraphrase here, of course, this was the time of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, when, I don't know what he says, 50,000 Jews were rising up against the Germans with arms supplied to them by troops retreating from the east. Well, first of all, it wasn't 50,000 Jews involved in the uprising. It was maybe 1,000 Jews. But more importantly, I mean, that you can quibble over how many, etc. But more importantly, this meeting takes place 2 days before the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. So it wasn't like Hitler was saying, in 2 days, we're having the Warsaw Ghetto. I'm looking at my wristwatch was in there. And 2 days, we're having the Warsaw Ghetto uprising, and we got to get the Jew, and we don't want that to happen in Budapest. So it'd be like saying that George Bush said on 9/9, not 9/11, well, we've got to put up special defenses around the World Trade Center and around the Pentagon because there's going to be an attack on them. Makes as much sense.
Right. So kind of taking things that happen and putting them in different orders.
That's right. And when I have to say, when I first read that, I didn't pick up that this was 2 days before. Because it's a T. I think one is the 17th and one is the 19th or something.
Yeah.
So if I didn't pick up.
Right. So I think, one thing you kind of embedded it in your responses, and I just want to pull it out, is, and I really had the privilege of zooming into a freshman seminar that you're teaching this term on memoirs, and you're teaching another course related to trials. You teach a lot. And you teach a lot of courses that are not 200-person courses, but that are really like, 10, 15, 25-person courses. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about why you keep teaching, maybe when perhaps you wouldn't necessarily have to if you so chose not to, and why teach freshmen? Like, what is it about the Emory?
I love teaching freshmen. I love teaching freshmen, and I love teaching them in the fall. They're not jaded. They're excited, they're fresh, they're interested, I just love it. And I love also that, and I have them do short papers, because I love teaching them how to write. Many of them come from schools where they've done great writing, some less so. So, I always say you can write a short declarative sentence, and when we're reading a Primo Levi, so one of the iconic memoirs of Auschwitz, or another book, I'll say, oh, look, a short declarative sentence, you see, and I love that kind of teaching. And I've been very lucky that I can teach small seminars. The students who can't get into my classes are not happy about that. But as long as I'm teaching online, I want the number of students that I can see on a screen. So I have a big screen, but still there's only so many you can see. And my departments, I'm in both Jewish studies and religion, have been accommodated me. Maybe they don't want to fuss with me because I'm a pain in the neck, when I don't get what I want. Not that's not true, but sometimes. So I'm very lucky in my ability to do that. And the Zooming actually is quite exciting. I have this semester, I have a student who comes in on from Beijing, and one from Rio de Janeiro. And last semester I had someone from Panama, and then of course a number of domestic locations. But more and more, we're hoping in the fall that students will be on campus and will be able to be face to face, get vaccinated.
And I've always been just so, from my own experience, kind of dropping in even just for one day this semester, and another day, was it in the spring? I'm losing track of time.
The fall.
In the fall. But the really robust conversation that you all have is something that I know I remember from my time as a student, and is certainly something that I see you cultivate all the time, to really get students talking to each other, get them talking to you talking to them. It's, this is, while the lecturing is important, that really rigorous conversation is certainly the piece of my own education that I remember the most.
I tell the students very often a little segment. There was a physicist who taught at Columbia, Isaac Rabi, R-A-B-I, who happened to have won the Nobel Prize. So I guess he was not so, not such a poor physicist, but in his autobiography, he tells the following story. He was an immigrant. His family were immigrated from Eastern Europe, came to the Lower East Side, as did millions of other Jews. And when he would come home from school, his mother would say to him, Isaac, not did you know the answers, but Isaac, did you ask a good question? In fact, if the people listening Google Isaac Rabi, did you ask a good question, you will find that anecdote. And I tell that to my students. I said, you don't have to know all the answers, have great insights, but a good question is terrific, especially one that I don't know the answer to, So I encourage that. And then I also make class participation. I hate having to do this, but I make class participation part of their grade, because that's crucial. If it's a small seminar and a student's going to come and just not ask or talk, I mean, I understand that students are reluctant, and sometimes, especially when you're first year, everyone knows the answer and I don't know the answer. So ask a good question, and I work very hard at that, and generally I'm pretty lucky, or else the word has gone out. If you're not going to talk, don't take your class.
Yeah, and I see in the Q&A there's a question from Sam, who's asking about our Holocaust courses, primarily discussion based, primarily lecture based, and I've experienced from the dual roles that I've had, both as a student in one many moons ago, and then as someone who now comes into yours, that one of the things that I think Emory does so well, and that you really do so well, is it's both and. It's
both and. It's not either or. It's not either or. And we all try to make it that way. And I even try to do that when I have a class of 70 or 80 students, when I do my general history of the Holocaust. But certainly in my seminars, it's not only discussion is not only a desideratum, desirable, but it's a requirement, because otherwise it's just me lecturing to a small group of students, which is boring to me.
So I think as we're winding down here, what you really picked up on a moment ago, I'm going to press on a little bit further. I love that anecdote about, did you ask a good question today? Because I think that it encapsulates your class, to me, it encapsulates the entire university experience in one form or another, because what are we learning if not to ask better questions of whatever discipline we're in and whatever way in which we approach things. I had always loved as a TA reading the very last final exam question about what's your new question. At the very beginning of class, you asked your students, what's your question walking in? And then at the end, they could either answer that question or they could ask a new one.
Right.
Almost everybody asked a new one, and they asked a better one, which was one of the most wonderful things of looking at that, is that the question just became so much more complicated in the best possible way. And I'm thinking about our audience here for this call tonight, that we're joined by so many students who are about to begin this next really exciting chapter of their life on a college campus. And I'm wondering if we can model a little bit that last question that you have in your final exam. What's your question for them as they begin their
Right.
journey?
All of them have worked very hard to get into an Emory University. Especially in the past couple of years with, all the changes with the pandemic and more students and all the other things, which they know far better than I, but in my conversations with the admissions office, they bring me up to speed. What do you want to get out of these 4 years? What do you want to walk away with? And, to think about that. And you can take courses which, you'll guarantee these EAs and things like that. But think about the deeper experience. You're going to a university. Emory has many unique aspects, maybe not uniquely unique. You can't modify unique. I know that if something is either unique or it's not, but I'm going to modify it. Then I'll, you'll probably take, be upset as a person of literature and language. I can do that, okay. But one of the things that makes Emory somewhat unique, there we go again, is that there's a great emphasis on teaching undergraduates, and it's valued. I've taught at universities where students were seen as a pain in the neck, coming, I have to have office hours, that kind of thing. Not so at Emory. There is tremendous emphasis on meeting with students, being available to students, interacting with students. Even this year, when we, especially in the fall, when the distancing and before vaccines and all that was so great, I had all my students come to my one at a time, either meet me at my house if they were, physically in Atlanta. I live not far from campus. We sat outside. We ate ice cream and berries or something, which is always good. And just so I could see them in a three-dimensional way. And then we did an exit meeting when at the end of the semester. I did the same thing with the students this semester in my freshman class. I didn't want them to be only faces on a screen in a box. I wanted to have that personal connection. So I would say no matter, and I know some students haven't yet decided, but we do hope to see you here at Emory. If a teacher says, these are my office hours, go. And you don't have to go saying, well, I didn't understand what you said yesterday. And, in the half-hour mark, you said this, that, or the other. But just, I want to get to know you better. I'd like to know more about you. I read this piece that you assigned, and I found it interesting, and we didn't really discuss it in that great in depth in class. Most faculty, most of my colleagues, far, few and far between would not only appreciate that, but welcome it. So reach out and take stuff. I mean, of course, you're going to have to choose a major, and probably people already asking you, oh, where are you going? But past year, it's been, where are you applying? Where are you going? And now what are you majoring in? You don't have to know yet. You can figure it out as you go along. Not in the latter half of your senior year, because then you'll be not in good shape. But also take things out of your comfort zone. So you learn things that you hadn't really thought about before. There is great value in a liberal arts education. And the last thing, and maybe this is a skill, well, it's not just a skill, write. Don't run away from courses with writing requirements. Learn to write. Doesn't matter where you end up, whether you end up in a corporate office, a legal office, a medical office, whatever it might be, a business, doesn't matter. You're going to have to be able to write and write in a coherent fashion that will grab the interest and make people understand what it is you're saying. So I think those would be amongst my wisdoms that I would share.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And, you know, again, I think, you know, what has become a 20-year plus relationship of mentorship and of learning from each other began because I walked through your door as a freshman one afternoon, completely cold. And, you know, I would encourage those on the call to really take that seriously and do the same. That's the reason that you all are there, and it's really has always been my really amazing experience with every professor I've had at Emory.
I think the other thing I want to add, Leah, just excuse me for interrupting, but I was your teacher, so I can do that, right? I do that with people who weren't my students, but it's a habit of mine. But I think the other thing students should know, and President Fenves talked about this in his introduction, that Emory is a place that's very much dedicated to making a difference, to ethical values. Many universities talk about that, but it's really not a value. I saw that up close and personal. I saw that during my trial with the support the university gave me, the release from teaching, and the way I wasn't here, but the way I'm told the campus erupted in joy when they learned of the victory in my case. They felt that there was something here that was more than just supporting one of their faculty. There was something here of ethical value, ethical meaning that deserves support. And I will forever be grateful for that.
So I think I want to turn now to some of the questions that have been popping up in the chat. One that has just come through has been a question as to whether you've ever experienced students denying or challenging the history of the Holocaust within your own classroom, and if so, how do you present your experience from your trial as a part of that conversation, or just how do you respond if that's something that comes?
I haven't experienced in my class. I think any student who comes here would be smart enough if they were, if not to take my class in that way. I mean, it's so easy to prove them wrong. It's so, because we have the documents there. I mean, we have now, Emory set up after my trial a website called hdot.org, holocaustdenialontrial.org. It's an Emory website, but it has its own portal for security reasons. But you'll see the transcripts of the trial, you see the reports, you'll see the comments, et cetera, et cetera. So I've never experienced in my class. What I have experienced is students just befuddled, that's the only word I can think of, by the notion that there would be people who would deny. How can someone deny this? And of course, they're right. But as we've seen with so many other conspiracy theories in this day and age, it is part of a conspiracy that the Jews have conspired to create this myth to get sympathy, to get money. It's rooted, Holocaust denial is a form of anti-Semitism. Mm-hmm. Just like we should make that parallel. I know my colleague Professor Anderson was speaking to a group of students earlier this week. People who say, "Oh, slavery, you know, it was the lost cause. Slavery wasn't so bad. Slaves got 3 square meals a day. They got room and board. Everybody worked hard. There were lots of indentured servants in the colonies and then in the Americas at that time. You know, let's not make such a big deal of it." That's rewriting of history. That's denial of history. And that is, at its root, it's racist, because it's denying the experience of a group of people, Black people, and a horrific experience. You know, no indentured servant could have his family sold out from under him. An indentured servant eventually got his freedom. It's not the case. They weren't owned property. I mean, I have to go into that, but the whole idea of the lost cause and all that is, one would say, well, it's just Southern pride. No, it's not. It's racism. And so too with Holocaust denial. This is not a mistake. This is not someone who just didn't see one document. Remember, I'm sort of coming back where I started. No evidence, no narrative, no witnesses. It's a form of anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So as we're kind of wrapping up here, are there any kind of another question or last kind of words of advice that you would leave with these students on the line who are again kind of entering this new chapter and thinking about what they're going to get out
Yes.
of college?
Never have we needed in this country and in much of the world, but certainly in this country, a generation of students who have learned how to think critically, to think analytically, to look at evidence, to not be swayed by I read it on the internet or I saw on Facebook or something like that, to ask good questions, to be willing to say that's not true. And you can't just say to someone who comes up with a conspiracy theory, though we sometimes want to, you're a blooming idiot. You want to sort of just knock them in the nose or something. But we've got to do our homework before we share something, make sure it's true. We are in desperate need today. We saw it in January 6th on Capitol Hill. We've seen it in so many other things in Charlottesville a couple of years ago, of people who can think critically, who have an ethical grounding, a moral grounding, a way of looking at the world, of looking at what's happened in the recent past and using that as a guideline for how they should live their lives and what they should do. I'm really privileged all these years to teach here. I've been teaching here now, I don't know, it's close to 30 years, something like that. To be at a place which values those precise things. And I'm glad to have students who want to learn about it.
And I keep thinking of where circling back of where we started about all of those good questions and about that at the end of the day, yes, your major is important. Yes, the career path you choose in life is important, but really that this is about the ways that we look at the world and the ways that we understand the world and what we bring to the world, and the type of analysis and the type of good questions and complicated questions, right, that we ask, and that I think you've really challenged us to think about and that you've challenged us to ask all evening. So I thank you for that.
You're welcome. I thank you for doing this. We're very proud of you and very proud of the work you're doing, and we brag on you a lot. So.
Well, it's a pleasure, and I say to the students on the line this evening that Emory was that place for me. It was that place for me, 20 years ago. It was that place for me in graduate school. It continues to be that place for me now. I'm certainly very much in touch with Dr. Lipstadt. I'm also very much in touch with other professors across the university in different ways. And that I think that too is really a wonderful thing that Emory brings, is this really wonderful wellspring of teachers who demand that we ask good questions and that we ask new questions, as I hope all of you will do. So with that, I think we're going to close out the evening, and I thank all of you for your time. And we hope to, or Dr. Lipstadt hopes to be able to see you.
I'll see you on campus. Come visit. Find my office hours, knock on the door, link to me. Always happy to talk to students.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.